So we're very pleased tonight to have Jonathan Chanis. Dr. Chanis is going to speak to us about this topic, and he's worked in energy and energy finance for over 25 years. So he's been in the private sector. He's also taught at Columbia University. He's got tremendous experience, and I'll just give you a brief overview of his background. He was a senior trader at Caxton Associates, where he traded energy and emerging market equities, commodities, and currencies. He worked with AIG, building its third-party asset management business, and he worked on the trading desk of J. Aron & Company. He was the vice president at the Bank for Foreign Economic Affairs of the USSR, that was the old Soviet Union, and at the New York Mercantile Exchange. Dr. Chanis is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and an advisory board member and a member of the board of directors of the Energy Forum, and that's for over 20 years. He holds a PhD in political science from the Graduate School at CUNY and a BA in economics from Brooklyn College. He has taught for a number of years at Columbia University at the School for Public and International Affairs, and his courses have consistently been rated as among the very top by students. He received in 2014 the Distinguished Teaching Award at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. So we are very pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Chanis. Let's have a hand of applause.
Thank you very much for coming. Can you all hear me?
Do you want the lights there?
Yeah, we could.
Could we dim the lights?
The talk I'm going to have with you tonight is based off of an article which I wrote in the Great Decisions series, which is outside. It was an article looking at U.S. foreign policy and its relationship to petroleum. And it was actually very interesting for me to write it because it gave me the opportunity to really step back and look at the long period of time that the United States has been involved with petroleum and how it interacted with foreign policy. And I found some very unusual patterns of behavior which are very notable, and I think when you become aware of them, it may help you determine what you think is a better policy for the United States to pursue. But before I draw you into that much deeper discussion, let me just tell you my conclusion. I always like to start with what I'm going to conclude. And basically, some of you who have followed this realize that the oil and gas revolution, the so-called energy revolution, really has profoundly changed the domestic energy industry, oil and gas industry in the United States. And I'll show you some very nice slides that will illustrate that in a little while. But the energy revolution really has transformed the industry in a major way. The industry is, even at lower prices today, last year was a little bit more was much more difficult, but the industry has become much more vigorous, much stronger, and it produces a lot more energy. And not that it ever had, but it's up there to being close to all-time highs. And that's very important. But when you look at the relationship between energy and foreign policy, you might think that with the United States producing so much more energy, perhaps there's more room in foreign policy to pursue a different foreign policy than we've pursued over the last, say, 45 or 75 years. You can pick a number and date it wherever you'd like. But what I have concluded from looking at this closely is that in spite of the real major changes that the oil and gas revolution has had on the industry, you can't really find much of a major impact on U.S. foreign policy, which for people who believe that foreign policy is driven by energy interest or the oil companies, that's a little shocking. But I think it's pretty clear that the impact of greater oil production or natural gas production on foreign policy has not been that great. And I think there's a couple of reasons why that's so. And the first reason is that foreign policy is actually multi-causal. That it's difficult to take one variable and say, this explains American foreign policy. Our desire for oil is all that motivates us to have this relationship with Saudi Arabia or to do things in Venezuela. Life is much more complicated than that in most instances, so a monocausal explanation, in this case petroleum, really doesn't do justice to the many factors that make foreign policy what it is. A second reason why the energy revolution has not had as visible, and just to back up for a second, it has had some impact on foreign policy. One could very easily argue that the United States, under the Obama administration, particularly the second Obama term, has withdrawn a bit from the Middle East, that the United States is much less active in the Middle East than it was 10 years ago. We didn't intervene that actively in Libya. We're not, until the raid last week in Yemen, we had no raids into Yemen with American forces, at least that were made public. So it has had, we're not actively engaged in Syria. So clearly there has been some impact, and I would assert to you that greater domestic energy production has given the United States a degree of freedom to be less engaged. Okay, so there has some impact. And also, when the United States wanted to sanction Iran before the Iran deal, when it wanted to sanction the Russians, it was able to pursue those policies because there was a surplus of oil. There's lots of why there's a surplus of oil we'll get into in a little while, but that, the United States production was a very important part of that surplus. So it has had some impact. But what I would assert to you when you look at the data is that the oil and gas revolution has not gone far enough to profoundly change the United States' vulnerability to supply disruptions. And in particular, even though we have greater volumes of production, the United States is still very much subject to the international price or prices of oil. So that reason that the oil and gas revolution hasn't gone far enough is why I would assert to you that it hasn't had a bigger impact on foreign policy. And what I'd like you to think about as I'm speaking with you now, and perhaps for the questions and answer period, is that if that is the case, and I'm pretty comfortable asserting that to you, and I have lots of information and data to share with you to make that point, if that's the case, we're at a very unique moment now, hence Great Decisions, the name of the series, because the United States has it within its domestic policy to take certain actions which would continue the oil and gas revolution, which would make it easier to produce more energy. This has profound domestic consequences in terms of the environment, in terms of people's property rights, in terms of how you drive, and where you drive, and what kind of cars you drive. We have domestic policy levers which could arguably further reduce the level of U.S. vulnerability, and we'll talk about what that means in a little while. So the issue, really, I think, for us to think about through the talk and the questions is that, is this something that you want? Do you want the United States domestic policies to favor oil and gas interests because it gives the United States the option of not intervening in other parts of the world as assertively? If the United States is it's less dependent on the international oil markets, if the United States is not a recipient of the international oil market forces, but helps make those forces through its own actions, it arguably has a much larger room for maneuver, and because its vulnerability is less. And the question I have for you when you think about this is, that something you want? Do you want to explicitly link domestic energy policy to U.S. foreign policy? Because the links have not been as explicit in the public debate as I think they should be. All right, so that's my conclusion and where I think we should go with that. I'd like to start off. I'm going to walk you through some of the basics on oil and gas. This is a fairly large, diverse group. I know some of you know a lot about oil and gas, and some of you probably don't know a lot about oil and gas. So you'll have to forgive me if it's too basic or too advanced, but I'm trying to strike that nice balance. So the first thing I want to show you is something that most people do not appreciate. I mean, as far as having taught about energy for a long time being involved in the area. I mean, where does gasoline come from? It comes from the pump. It's like, where does electricity come from? It comes from the socket. Americans have a very poor idea of how they get their energy. And, perhaps some of that is the fault of schools, of education. That's not what I want to focus on now, but I can just tell you that all the research, the Pew Foundation indicates Americans don't really understand how the energy markets work and where they're, a relatively simple thing, like where does the gasoline in your car, most of you have cars, just knowing where you live in your zip code, I can tell you most of you have cars. Where does that come from? How does it get there? What's the supply chain that makes it happen? So one of the things, if you look at this chart, the hydrocarbon molecule is the basis for our existence. Everything we have is based on hydrocarbon molecules. Everything in this room is either made with hydrocarbon molecules from petroleum or natural gas. If it's not wood or stone, it's made with oil and gas. And if it's not made with oil and gas, it's transported to where it's consumed by oil and gas or coal. Right? So, this shows, this is the November consumption of energy, all energy measured in BTUs by the Energy Information Administration. They have a great website, by the way, if any of you want to spend time looking at it. Just reams of data if you're interested in data. So this is the latest that came out on Friday. It's for the month of November 2016. And it shows you that of all the energy we consumed during that month, 38% came from petroleum. Most of that, over 3/4, is from driving your cars and trucks and deliveries. But natural gas for heating your homes and for electrifying your homes was another 29%. This is all converted into BTUs, so it's all equalized. And then coal, 13%. But if you add that all up, that is 80% of your energy comes from the hydrocarbon molecule. And that is a very... that is a large amount to come from hydrocarbons. And we'll talk a little bit more about carbon and greenhouse warming in a few minutes. But at this point, just pointing out to you how dependent your life is on oil and gas might be revelatory for some people. So given how dependent we are on oil and gas, it's only natural that we talk about it in terms of energy security. We tend not to talk as much about natural gas or coal or hydropower or even now renewables in terms of energy security because these sources of energy are largely made in the United States. So we don't have to worry about foreign governments or foreign bad actors cutting off our supply of wind power in Michigan. We don't have to worry about we have to worry about Mother Nature in Washington State and hydropower, but we don't have to worry about, we do worry about terrorism, but that's really minor. Oil and gas is what we really are concerned, really petroleum, oil is what we're concerned about in terms of energy security, because it's not completely supplied from domestic sources, and that's very important. But when you think about energy security, it encompasses everything, but for our purposes, and to me the most exciting is always petroleum, because of the foreign component. We used to get a lot of gas from Canada. We're actually starting to export more gas to Canada now, which is interesting. The whole supply chain is changing. The thing about petroleum security is not that we're running out. I'm going to show you a slide in a few slides which might shock you. There is plenty of petroleum in the world. The peak oil scare of 10 years ago was fictional. Every so often, it's cyclical, there's these huge scares that we're running out of oil. We are not running out of oil, and I'll show you the nice, interesting slide in a bit. There's plenty of oil in the world right now. It's just located in the wrong place. Most of it is in the Middle East, particularly the Persian Gulf, the single largest source. And as most of you can appreciate, there are governments in that region that are particularly friendly towards the United States, that don't wish the United States well. So because of the fact that so many of these governments control such a large share of the global oil market, and the U.S. is part of that market, it's just another reason why the United States has been concerned with energy security. One of the interesting things is that this wasn't always the case, and at the very end we'll talk about the different phases of petroleum and foreign policy. The United States was the dominant oil supplier to the world from the beginning of the oil age, which we can roughly date from the beginning of the automotive age, or let's say 1910, 1911, pick a date around there, up until now. Up until about 1945, the United States was the dominant supplier of oil to the world. And one of the interesting things is that after 1945, the United States became and continues to be what you can think of as the stage manager for the world's petroleum supply. The United States is at the very heart of what you could call, it's called in political science terms, an international regime for supplying oil around the world. The United States is the largest, the single most important actor that makes this work. So if the Europeans want oil, let's think of it, the Europeans or South Africa, if they want oil, the United States is really at the center of the system that allows them to get the oil at the prices that they can get them today. All right. And just one last thing on the generalities. Often people think that we're going to rush out of the oil age, the fossil fuel age. Energy transitions take a very long time, decades. We actually haven't had many energy transitions, really from wood to coal, coal to petroleum. Now we're going a little bit from petroleum to natural gas, and the longer one will be from fossil fuels to renewable alternative energies, right? These take decades. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, most automobiles in the United States will be internal combustion engines running off of petroleum. 20 years, most of them will be. Electric cars are growing quickly, but they're growing quickly from such a small base that they're really not going to make a big enough dent for a very long time. And I think all of you would appreciate that if you could not get gasoline for a week or 2 weeks, and the trucks that deliver food to your supermarkets couldn't get diesel fuel, your life would be turned upside down, right? So that's the point of energy security, and the notion that we're going to conserve, we're going to become more efficient, and we're going to transform the energy system quickly is just not realistic, right? There's a difference between idealism and utopianism. I mean, it's going to take a very long time. So fossil fuels are going to be around, whether we like it or not, for several more decades, okay? Now, the next one is climate change. You can no longer talk about fossil fuels and energy without climate change, and this is without talking about climate change. And this is an important thing, because climate change is real, the atmosphere is warming up, all the data indicates that, there's no denying that. But there's certain things to keep in mind when you think about climate change. This is actually U.S. carbon emissions, and they peaked in 2007 at 6 billion tons, and then they've declined by about 12.5% since then. And this whole decline here was not based on renewable fuels or some virtuous government policy. It was based on the oil and gas revolution, or actually in this case in particular, it was based on the natural gas revolution. It's the same things that made the revolution happen in petroleum worked in natural gas. As a matter of fact, the revolution took place in natural gas first. And what we did during this period is we substituted natural gas for coal in the stationary power sector. And we've been closing coal plants. We haven't built a coal plant in years, right? So we close coal plants and we build natural gas plants. And this whole decline is all due to natural gas, not wind or solar, which has increased substantially. But it's really natural gas. So when you think about that, keep that in the back of your mind. I mean, some people will argue that this decline is not remotely steep enough to solve our problems. But there's just a couple of things I want to point out about this, because as I said to you, I think that climate change is a very real problem, but it will be a problem in decades for most people. And just as an aside, the connection that many people make between extreme weather and climate change is not certain. The IPCC, which is the government organization, the intergovernmental organization from the UN, responsible for the best climate science data and work, says there is some link, particularly between precipitation events. But, I very frequently hear, you get a horrible, you get 70-degree weather last Friday or last weekend, and all of a sudden it's climate change. That's not based on scientific evidence. Okay? It may turn out to be, but there isn't enough scientific evidence for the vast majority, including the IPCC, to say that's true. So we're really looking at something that is set to happen over a very long period of time, maybe 2070, 2080, 2100. And when you think about climate change, the question for you all is, what are you willing to do about it? How much will you spend? How will you change your life? And if you're not willing, will you spend $2 trillion to knock 1/100th of a degree of temperature off of a model's prediction in the year 2100? I mean, what is the right trade-off? So a lot of the controversy, such as it is, besides the deniers, which are a different issue, a lot of the real policy controversy has to do with what are you willing to pay now to get some thought of benefit in the future. And then the second thing I just want to point out to you, particularly in this area, is that climate change legislation and restrictions has a very real impact on people depending on their income. And maybe we're not as sensitive to it, but the median household income in the United States in 2015 was about $58,000. That's not a single person, that's the household. Now, if you raise the price of energy by 10 or 15% to a person making $35,000 or $40,000 a year, that's a big deal. And climate change, one thing we can be certain of, things to fix climate change are not going to make energy cheaper. So as we do these things, you make energy much more expensive. So we just have to be very careful about the changes that we make, because it really disadvantages some people and doesn't hurt others. That's what public policy is about. In many ways, you can look at public policy as trying to get a benefit and impose the cost on somebody else. You have to be cynical about it. That's a cynical definition of it. But anyway, when you look at climate change and legislation, I just would like you to think of this graph. Germany, by the way, with a much more aggressive policy over the last 20 years, has not reduced emissions much more than this. There may be a percentage point or so further down than us, and electricity costs 3 times more than it costs here. They don't have the oil and gas revolution. Europe has stopped it for other reasons. They don't have the resources that we have. Now, let's see the next one. This is the oil and gas revolution. For those of you that like charts, it is an unbelievable chart. A hockey stick of production. This huge increase. This is 1951 until 2016, last year. Actually, the data, that little wag at the end, that's January 2017's monthly data. I wanted to put that in there to just illustrate it. So the rest is annual except for that one. That's why I said January. This is all the result of the oil and gas revolution, which some of you know. Ed Morse was here a couple of months ago. Some of you probably went to that. This is hydraulic fracturing, which is about injecting water and chemicals and sand into rock formations that have hydrocarbons and busting them open, and then propping them open with the sand and letting the oil and the gas flow back out after you broke the rock. It's rock. Petroleum, these are rocks. It's not like a sponge, it's a rock. And then it's something else called horizontal drilling, where we used to drill wells down vertically. So if you had a field, you'd put the wells every half a mile or every quarter of a mile, and you drill a hole. Now we actually drill, I don't know my distances here as well, but some of you may know. You can be in, where the Domino sugar sign is in Queens? Some of you might know that. Across in Queens on the East River, you can be in that location in Queens, and you can drill under the East River for 2 miles now, and you can pop up in Midtown Manhattan and be within, a few feet of where you wanted to be. That's how impressive this now is. Literally, they're going 2 miles away, and from one drill pad, they've reduced the footprint. They go and they'll sink one well down and then branch off into 4 or 5 or 6 different laterals, they're called. And then the third part of this, it's in the article if you ever want to pick it up and read it, is seismic, our ability to use sound waves to figure out where the hydrocarbons are located. So this, again, is just unbelievable. And I'm trying to sensitize you, you're not going to all be oil specialists, but people think of crude oil, which is the most important part of liquids, but because of the United States geologic bounty with natural gas and the type of formations we have, we also produce what's called natural gas liquids. And natural gas liquids are also very important in terms of making refined products for your cars and trucks and airplanes. So this is a better number, and we're really, we are an energy superpower. We have 16% of all the world's liquid production right now, even though we have maybe 5% of the world's resource base, because our system has figured out how to make this work. And also OPEC is a collusive organization which wants to restrict production. So even though they can produce oil at $7 or $5 and we can produce it at 20 or 25 or higher, we still produce it because they want to restrain their production. But we are a superpower of liquids. We're also #1 in natural gas. We're #1 in nuclear power. We're second in coal to China, and we're 4th in hydro. So we are a superpower of energy. The problem is we're also a superpower of consumption. So we produce a lot, but we consume a lot. And again, you know, the big one for us that's the problem is petroleum, because the rest of these, natural gas, we're starting to export now increasingly. If the world market, if the prices make sense, we can actually become a large exporter. It's a question, will prices be high enough? Nuclear power is difficult to export, although our connections to Canada and Mexico are real. And we're still basically flat or a slight net importer of electricity, I believe, but somebody might want to check that. And then coal, we export about 10% of what we produce now. So it's pretty, it's pretty significant. But again, petroleum, because of our linkage to the global economy, because right now we're importing 1/4 of our resources in petroleum. In 2007, we were importing 60% of our petroleum. And it's dropped because of this. This is really 2008-ish. So as that production has gone up, our imports have dropped from 60% to 25, 26% today. That's pretty important. This is the price, and I want to show you this price graph because it really, if you can understand what's behind this, you can understand a very important concept called the petroleum investment cycle. All commodities have investment cycles, and they differ slightly. You know, iron or copper, they're longer or shorter. It can be 7 years or 12 years or 15 years. In energy, you know, we've only had a few of these cycles, so the observations are not very large, but 7, 8, 9, 10 years is an investment cycle for petroleum. And that's because the oil and gas industry is really very unique. There isn't another industry in the world that uses as much capital, as much money, and has to wait as long to get its return back. I mean, the amount of money we're talking about, at the peak years in 2014, we were spending globally over $600 billion a year to look for oil and gas. Now we're spending about $250 because of the lower price. But it's huge, and what makes this work is the price. And when the price gets high, people go out and look for oil. They not only go to places where they haven't looked before, but they also work on the technology, which is what got us the oil and gas revolution. A fellow named George Mitchell, which is a great side story, the book Frackers, if any of you have looked at it. So the price is the key, and if you lag this chart by about 7 or 8 years, you would get the supply cycle. The price goes up, people look for oil. They find oil, the price goes way down. And we've had several cycles like this for a number of years, and the price is the really, you know, it's the single most important thing which makes the cycle work. And as a result, you can say that we have these cycles of scarcity and abundance. We have abundance, and then we don't invest, which leads to scarcity. And then we have the scarcity, and we go crazy investing hundreds of billions of dollars. We find massive amounts of oil, and then it's another 10 years before we look for oil again. So the fact, though, is that even though we've only had several of these cycles, the abundance cycles tend to be much longer than the scarcity cycles. We're short of oil. Oil is very high, for 4 or 5 years, and then this is a 14-year streak. My hypothesis is we're going to have another 10, 12, 15 years of relatively low oil prices. That doesn't mean it can't be broken by a spike due to particularly a war of some sort or a geopolitical event, but on the whole, because of what we've done, oil prices should stay relatively low. And to give you an illustration, which might shock some of you, this slide was produced by BP a couple of weeks ago. Well, giving you the really fresh information. It made it to the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago too, which I was impressed. Actually, it was in one of the blogs, it wasn't in the paper. Over the last 35 years, for every barrel of oil that the world consumed, the oil industry found 2 more. That's staggering. And when you look at it, what this tells you is that oil is very abundant and we're never going to consume. This is technically recoverable. This isn't looking at the price. This is just telling us that we know where the oil is, we found it, we know how to produce it, and the only thing that's missing is the price that makes it happen. And the exact numbers are about 2.6 trillion barrels of technically recoverable reserves. And the forecasts for what we're going to consume over the next few years is about 0.7 trillion. We're never going to consume all this oil. It's just not going to happen given how long we're going to be using. By 2050, the consumption of petroleum is going to be way down. So petroleum is very, very abundant. As part of that change, the United States has contributed mightily to adding to those reserves. And we found oil, particularly in West Texas. It's called the Permian, if some of you really want to know the details. There are oil fields in the United States that are competitive at $20, $22, $23. The price of those is about $54. So at $20, you can make a lot of money. You can produce it and sell it at $54. Most other fields, it's called the production supply curve. It gets more expensive in other places, but we have a tremendous amount of oil in West Texas, and we're continually improving, we're continually lowering the price of production. So what that did for us is lower our import dependence, as I've mentioned. And that, I would argue to you, has made us a lot more secure. And just to get a little political sciencey on you, I think there's 2 major concepts that people really need to understand if they want to think about energy security. The first is sensitivity and vulnerability. Sensitivity is that when something happens, does it affect you, right? Vulnerability is that if something happens and it affects you, what does it cost you to change, to get back to a position where you're not affected? So I like to use, with my students, my favorite example. I'm pretty sensitive to the rain. If it rains, I don't like getting wet, but I'm not particularly vulnerable because I have umbrellas, I have a raincoat, I have boots, I have the luxury sometimes of deciding whether I'm not going to go out, right? So I'm not that vulnerable. So just because you're sensitive doesn't mean you're vulnerable. But this is an important slide because if you're not sensitive, you're not vulnerable. If the United States doesn't import petroleum from foreign places, its ability to get cut off is reduced, although there is still a price impact. But the more domestic production that the United States has, if there's a price impact, there's still a lot of people in the country who benefit from the higher price. So would you rather have people benefiting in Texas and North Dakota and Louisiana or Alaska and even parts of California? Or do you want to have people benefiting in Riyadh and UAE and, not to pick on them, or Nigeria? So it's much better to have lower import dependence than higher import dependence. So sensitivity and vulnerability is a very important part. And the other concept really is interdependence, dependence, independence. And that's important because, and it's very important in foreign policy terms, because what does dependence mean? When you're dependent on somebody, dependence is an asymmetrical relationship. You need something from somebody, and they don't need anything from you. So they have power over you because you need something from them, and you don't need anything from that other person. So interdependence is when there's a symmetrical relationship. You're dependent on somebody else, and he or she's dependent on you. Dependence is when you're dependent, there's someone who's independent on the other side, right? So these are two very important, I don't want to belabor it, but if you really want to understand energy security, these are two very critical things that you just need to sort of internalize. And the takeaway really from this again is that the lower the U.S. import dependence, the less sensitive we are. It doesn't mean that we're not invulnerable, but we're less vulnerable, at least in this regard. Okay, and that was my opening question, my opening comment to you that, should our policy be to do things to drive this number even lower? There are policy changes the United States can make, which would drive this number lower. A lot of it is dependent on the price, which the United States doesn't really control. But the United States domestic policy action could actually affect the price, driving it lower, but you can think of it as a sweet spot almost. All right, so just to make it a little more closer to home, some of the work I've done, which I ran the numbers, it gave you nice charts in the article, to make it very real to people. When people have to spend too much money on gasoline in particular, it's not good. I mean, whatever you think of people's driving habits, we're wasteful. I mean, I drive a lot, less than I did, although I have a car that gets 40 miles to the gallon, and it's an internal combustion engine. It's not an electric. I still get 43 miles to the gallon in one of my cars. People don't like paying a lot for gasoline. There are, former Energy Secretary Chu said a few years ago under Obama that he wanted energy prices to be higher, and it set off a firestorm. Because again, that 50% below the median that can't afford high gasoline, the last thing they want is for you to make gasoline more expensive. But when you look at the numbers, if you look at it on pre-tax income, there's certain thresholds. I mean, many of you remember 1973, 1974, 1979, 1980. I mean, I'm old enough to remember this. I remember fist fights at gasoline stations. During Superstorm Sandy, you had gasoline here, right? New York City did have gasoline for almost 10 days, over a week for sure. When they started to get gasoline supplied back in, they put, out of necessity, a police car at every station that had gasoline. Because if they did not put a police car at that station, there would have been fights and stabbings and shootings. Because people behave very differently when they can't get gasoline. But the takeaway, because your lives depend on it, and you don't really appreciate it until you don't have it. At about 3%, below 3% is kind of the magic number. And this is actually a very good reference point. This is pre-tax income. If you want it, you might say, well, 3% is nothing. If you wanted to convert it to taxable income, you can basically double it if you include payroll taxes. So if your after-tax income, if you're spending 6% on gasoline, you're okay with that. It doesn't really make you unhappy. But as you get higher to 4% or to 8% of your after-tax income, you start to really become unhappy. You don't like it, you call your congressman, you want an investigation, you want them to tax the oil industry. It's not a good thing. And then over at 5% or 10% after tax, things get out of hand. That's when people become very agitated, violence at gasoline stations. Some of you may remember Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1979, where we had 3 days of rioting with thousands of people. Hundreds of people were demonstrating, burning cars. The point I'm making to you is that there are predictable numbers where we know that people become very unhappy. And Pre-tax, it's about 5%. After tax is about 10. But the point is that the sweet spot is around 3. And there's even a very tight inverse correlation between presidential popularity and the price of gasoline. One of the reasons why President Obama, I would argue to you, was so popular when he left office is because gasoline prices were low. If gasoline prices were 50 cents higher, the evidence is overwhelming. His popularity would have been lower. So this is an important relationship that is just worth keeping in mind, okay? Now, to the heart of what we're doing. Foreign policy. I went through the phases of U.S. foreign policy, and I divided them pretty neatly into 6 periods. The actual end dates in some cases are a little arbitrary. Should I have picked 1911 instead of 1900? But roughly the phases are correct. And one of the other things is when you look in terms of foreign policy, is oil an end? Are we worried about getting oil for ourselves, or is it a means? Are we using oil to influence the behavior of other people? And one of my conclusions from the work, which is not so surprising, it's not novel, is that the United States uses energy as a policy instrument. It uses petroleum as a policy instrument. And some people think it's like using food. You shouldn't use food as a weapon. You shouldn't use petroleum as a weapon. Well, personally, I don't have an issue with that. It's, we use military force, we use diplomacy, we use economic leverage. Petroleum is just another instrument of policy that we can use. So the first phase, when we were really dominant, it was a means. We supplied the rest of the world in the First and Second World War with most of their oil. We were very deeply involved in Mexico. When Mexico started to become problematic and nationalist, we shifted our attention to Venezuela. The oil companies became deeply involved in Venezuela. One can make a very interesting argument that a lot of Venezuela's trouble, it's pretty clear, Venezuela's troubles are deeply related to petroleum today. Venezuela's a complete mess, you follow it. Petroleum has a lot to do with it. I'm not blaming it on the United States. The United States was instrumental in helping construct the governments of Venezuela for decades. It got to the point that in the 1940s, during the Second World War, where the United States government intervened to help the private oil companies negotiate a deal with the Venezuelan government because the Venezuelan government wanted better terms. So the U.S. was so keen to get the oil moving, it was in the middle of the war, but it continued after, that it got deeply involved. So it's very clear that we use petroleum as an instrument of policy, and a lot of our other our preferences are derivative from this policy. So, for example, we cared about what happened in Venezuela. We care about what happens in Saudi Arabia because we use oil as an instrument of policy. If we were less concerned about using oil as an instrument of policy, it would perhaps reduce our incentive to care about the political orientation of these countries. Another derivative would be security guarantees to the region. We have a security guarantee with a number of Persian Gulf producers today, which actually came about first under Truman in 1949. We gave security guarantees to the Saudis, and we've reaffirmed them on multiple occasions, not the least of which was the 1991 liberation of Kuwait from Iraq occupation, right? So in this first phase, it means we did things, but the system sort of, for U.S. purposes, worked quite well because we had a lot of production, but production was starting to go down. So we shifted our attention to foreign producers, and we sent the oil companies went overseas and produced in other places. The second phase is very interesting because it, particularly at the end of the period, showed a lot of policy blindness. That the United States was very concerned about, it didn't see what was going to happen in 1973. It was a shock, not simply because it shocked the economy and hurt the economy. It was a shock because we were all very surprised. No one anticipated, no one believed in, well, no one's not, that's just true. Virtually no one believed in 1972 that oil prices can triple in 1 year. Subsequent to that, we all, if you've traded commodities, we all understand that. Sometimes things go up 3 or 4 times. That's not unnatural. But in 1972, no one thought that was possible. So policy blindness and we sort of ran headlong into this disaster because we weren't paying attention. The United States production was leveling out. 1970, it actually peaked. We had been increasing production, increasing, but the conventional fields that they were based on began to decline irreparably, we thought. And we were relying on production elsewhere, particularly the Persian Gulf. And that's, again, what drew us in. But then after that, the 73 to 74, we had this long stretch, remember back with those high prices, where things were very unpleasant for the United States. And we were concerned, we needed to get energy to run our own cars, to run our own industry. And we became ever more deeply involved, particularly after 1980, in Jimmy Carter's Carter Doctrine, which really, I would argue to you, drew us into the Middle East in a very definitive way. We came to the Middle East really militarily in 1980, and I would argue to you or assert to you, we really have never left. And the periods of almost unending wars, when you add it all up now, we've had more wars than peace, depending on how you count the wars, is directly begins in 1980 with this Carter Doctrine, which was very important. We didn't appreciate at the time what it would mean, but it was truly a seminal event in our military diplomatic history. And then it's the revenge of the investment cycle. Prices got so ridiculously high, they went from $1.80 in 1969 to $12 in 1974 to $40 in 1980. You know, when things go up 20 times, it changes people's behavior, and they start looking for oil in places where they never looked before, and they started changing technology. And we had, if I go back a couple of slides, we had this crash in prices. And the same thing happened again, where we had 10 or 12 years of underinvestment, and oil prices, the demand for oil increased, particularly because China, within 2 or 3 years, Chinese imports went from about 1 million barrels a day to 2 million barrels a day in about 3 years. A big number, that's a big jump in a world at the time was consuming about 80 or 82. So when you add a couple of million barrels, that really changed things. So what happened during that period is we started investing like mad. We had lots of oil, we were best friends with the Saudis. You know, the problem in many ways was not that the price of oil was too high, it was the price of oil was too low. But that went on for a decade or more, and we didn't invest. And then the Chinese started to import, and we started to consume. We had the housing bubble, remember that? And then all of a sudden, the demand for oil starts skyrocketing. And because of the nature of the business, you can't put $1 in today and get a barrel of oil tomorrow. You put $1 in today, you get a black barrel of oil in 5 years or 7 years. So in economic terms, we say the supply curve went vertical. No matter how high the price went, you weren't going to get another barrel of oil for a long time, right? The supply curve went vertical. Remember, they're supposed to go like that? Well, this went like that, right? So the only way you would ration oil consumption was by raising it so that people stopped buying it because they couldn't afford it. That changed the way people thought. And the industry turned around and just went at it again. And they invested hundreds of billions of dollars, and they perfected the technology of fracking and horizontal drilling and 3D seismic imaging, and we found all that oil. And that's sort of where we are today with all this oil that's left. You know, with this amazing amount of supply that kind of promises that the price is not going to skyrocket. But again, to bring my question back to you, do we want to go further? Do we want to push more oil out there? It's a very delicate balance with the price, because the more oil the U.S. produces, more oil anyone produces, in most cases, all things equal, the price goes down, right? But there is a sweet spot that if the United States could produce more, would it give it more freedom to be less interventionist in the Middle East? I have some other things about the Trump policies which may not be as interesting, because the upshot on that is that it's domestically, there's a lot of things he's going to do which will help the industry, but it's not going to be as quick and easy. One of the big things which concerns, not so much you, but it concerns other people in New England, in the so-called forgotten northeast corner of Connecticut, in Maine and Boston. Pipeline construction and pipeline building is going ahead much faster. And once these pipelines are built, it's extremely unlikely they will be unbuilt. You don't rip out pipelines. So the Keystone XL is probably going to get done very quickly. The Dakota Access, which you may have heard about, where these demonstrations are in North Dakota, that actually may be operational within weeks. That's how close it is. So once that's done, it's unlikely. Once they build a pipeline from the Marcellus gas in Pennsylvania to Michigan to export gas to Canada, they're not going to rip it out. So some of these things will happen. But other things like our relationship with Mexico, which has been shredded. Mexico is actually a very important partner for us in terms of oil. Not only do we still import 750,000 barrels a day of oil from Mexico, but they also buy a lot of our refined products. It's very good. They send us cheap oil, and we send them back expensive gasoline. It's a great deal for the United States. But President Trump, because of the issue of NAFTA and what's going on with the Mexicans, is putting this relationship in a very difficult position. Another thing is natural gas exports from Texas, which are very important to the industries. If this becomes a pawn in the relationship, it won't have a happy ending. So there's still a lot of things which are unclear, but again, back to my basic point about, do we want to push for even more, for lower vulnerability through greater domestic production so that provides us less incentive to intervene, or do we not care? So, how about questions?
In your chart, you had the list of South America, North America. There was something in blue called CIS. What was that?
A Commonwealth of Independent States. That's the name for the post-Soviet. Russia, let's go back and see.
No, go back.
The black chart.
The pretty.
Oh, that's the BP chart. Yeah. It's interesting they use that. It's not a term which is very common these days. The term that's much more common is FSU, former Soviet Union. But BP is actually one of the larger producers in Russia. So it's interesting that, and they actually, so it's Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan are significant oil producers. So it's Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Russia are the main parties of that. Okay? Yes, Miss?
But this,
Let me just, I'm sorry, the lady?
Have you addressed, in terms of foreign policy, the ability to refine petroleum product in this country? Do we have the capacity to do it? Americans typically have not liked having refining pollution near them, so is that a factor in all of this?
It's a definite factor, and oh yes, the question is that how does refinery capacity fit into this? Honestly, no one wants to live next to a refinery. I mean, living next to a refinery, it's, the oil and gas industry is a manufacturing business. They produce things, they produce oil, right? Refining is the end of that process, and there is good evidence that refineries it's unclear whether refineries aren't built in poor neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods usually come after the refineries are built. Like Richmond, the refinery was in Richmond before Richmond, California was Richmond, California. Richmond, California grew up around the refinery. That's one of the more famous examples of a refinery fire a few years ago that sent apparently a few thousand people to the emergency room for smoke inhalation. The United States is the Saudi Arabia of refining. We are a powerhouse in refining, and even though in the last 15 years we've closed a third of the refineries in the country, we've gone from about 148 refineries to slightly over 100, actual refining capacity has gone up because the refineries that exist become better and they add more bells and whistles and more units, and they just do a better job at making product. And again, I like to be very careful about this because most people probably drove here tonight. I mean, even if you drove an electronic car, you're, depending on exactly where you got your power from, a lot of that power was generated by natural gas or coal. Probably more than half of it. Maybe not so much in Connecticut, but most of the country, about 34% of our electricity comes from natural gas. Now it's for the first time less from coal, about 30% from coal. So we're looking at 60% of our electricity just from coal and natural gas. So even electronic cars, it's not such an easy solution. I mean, the solution is better regulation of the refineries. I actually go to a lot of refineries. I visit refineries. It's pretty cool, actually. They're industrial processes, and they're acutely aware of their neighbors, and some of them do better jobs than others. But again, I wouldn't want to live next to a fracking site. I wouldn't want to live next to a refinery. And it's a question of how do we make these trade-offs. So if people are impacted, how do you control the externalities? Most of these refineries go out of their way to try to be good neighbors and pay for their Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. But it's not a perfect system. But refining is one of the bright shining stars. As a matter of fact, there's something called processing gains. We're so good at this. When you put a barrel of oil in, you actually get out 7% or 10% more refined product. And it's because we sell the product by volume, not by weight. The weight doesn't change. The laws of physics haven't changed. But it expands, they're lighter. So we gain, when we buy crude oil from overseas and we process it here, we actually make more stuff to sell than we put in. And it's a hugely lucrative business. The United States started exporting refined product about 3 years ago, and it is a major benefit for the country and all of you. If you like to go to Europe, it makes the dollar stronger. Our trade balance deficit in oil in 2007 was about, I'm doing this from memory, but it was about $200 billion. And now it's about 60. It's huge. And that strengthens the dollar, so when you go to Europe and buy something in Paris or London, it helps you. Because people, we don't need to give foreigners our dollars. Sorry, this gentleman over here, I was saying,
why would the high production cost and dirt factor, if you will, of tar sands oil coming out of Canada, why would you pursue an XL pipeline?
Okay, the question has to do with the oil sands in Canada. The oil sands in Canada are in a very difficult position because they're high-cost oil. There's certain places, Canadian oil sands, or tar sands if you will, oil sands, tar sands, Kazakh oil, Brazilian oil. When you think of the production, the supply curve, the Permian Basin in Texas is down here, oil sands is up there. So they need, the Canadians need $50, $60 a barrel to make any money. But, and here's the but. First, in terms of carbon emissions, 85% of the emissions of any oil is produced when you consume it, not when you produce it, right? So, in terms of carbon, there's no doubt that Canadian oil is much dirtier. But so is Venezuelan oil, which we still import a lot of. As a matter of fact, the Canadians are moving faster to reduce the carbon footprint of their productions than the Venezuelans ever will, right? But the economic question is pretty easy to answer because the Canadians now produce about 3.5 million barrels a day already. And these are projects that were started 10 years ago because of that investment curve. The costs are sunk in most cases, and what we have seen is when investment fell off starting in 2014, when we dropped from that $650 billion a year to that $250 billion, a lot of that was in Canada. But we still have huge production capacity in Canada that is not going to go away, that will be there for 10 years or 15 years, because oil projects generally outside of tight shale oil in the US are very long-lived. So the XL pipeline is very important to bring that oil down, and what I would posit to you is that the oil got to the market, but it got to the market in rail cars. Rail cars is one of the worst ways to supply the refineries with oil, because it's much more dangerous with rail cars than it is with pipelines. And this actually goes to Dakota Access also. The record of the pipeline industry is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. You, as the ultimate consumers, we spill less than 0.1% of all oil transmitted. Right now, as you're sitting in this room, there is over 30 million barrels a day of petroleum, of crude oil and products being moved. 30 million barrels a day. Every couple of years, we have a horrendous spill. Some of the worst were Kalamazoo in Michigan, and the Yellowstone River in Montana or Wyoming? Well, Montana. And these were pretty horrendous. There's also the Mayflower in Arkansas. These were like the big three of the last 5 years. And that big would be 20,000 barrels. And, you know, I definitely am not making a light of it. These were big, ugly, environmentally devastating spills. But when you add up the total of, say, 60,000 barrels, and the fact that we move 30 million barrels a day, that's a pretty darn good number. So the XL, I would posit to you, is actually better for us because it makes the chances of a spill much less. And there have been some pretty horrendous deaths. I mean, there was a Negligente in Quebec, killed about 25 people. A rail car just slid on a 1% grade, which for a rail car is huge. Slid into the town in the middle of the night and exploded. So, you know, the XL makes, to my mind, it makes a lot of sense. And that's another thing I'll point out here, which we're drifting a little bit, but these are not really issues over the pipeline. When people are protesting, when they protested Dakota Access, or they protest XL, it had very little to do with the pipeline. These are what you can call proxy fights. It's a proxy for another battle. And the battle is, of course, climate change, carbon emissions, and where you want to be on petroleum. So the thinking is that if you never build another shred of energy infrastructure, if you stop any construction on any pipeline everywhere, you never let them drill another barrel of oil, we're going to ascend to heaven in greenhouse gas heaven. That's just not going to happen. So what I would posit to you to think about is that you want people in Boston to pay 46 cents a kilowatt for their electricity in February because Katrina Gore lays in a ditch that won't let a pipeline company lay a pipe to Boston? All right, tell that to the people in Boston, right? You know, these are necessary. And, you know, the thing about, so if you don't get the oil from Canada, we're going to get it from Venezuela. It's not going to, and things, to my mind, the easy way to think about this, things that constrain supply are generally bad. Things that constrain demand are much better. But the issue is that the people on the other side who want to move us faster to the non-fossil world, they're afraid of you. Why are they not at gas stations telling you that you're evil for driving your car, right? So what happens is when you try to constrain American supply, all you're doing is giving it out to foreign suppliers. I would tell you. So, XL makes it, and the Canadians and the Mexicans for that, we should get that on our knees and thank somebody that the Canadians and the Mexicans are our neighbors. We have a deal with Canada that in the event, it's less important today, if the Straits of Hormuz ever closed and there was a global oil shortage, the Canadians could not cut off their supply of oil to the United States. We have a treaty with them under NAFTA, by the way, which says they have to continue supplying the United States for the next 60 or 90 days. They can't do anything to us that they wouldn't do their own people. So, the relationship with Canada, in particular on energy, and actually, I was speaking with some Mexicans. The Mexicans are suffering now, back on independence, because we are deeply intertwined with Canada on energy. 12% of New York State's electricity comes from Canada. And by a lot of electricity here probably comes from Canada too. I don't know the exact number, but 12% comes from Canada. Canada is the United States' largest energy supplier. We're starting to sell them natural gas now and change the distribution patterns. But this relationship with the Canadians is incredibly important, incredibly valuable in terms of energy security, and it just makes sense. So to stop the XL because you want to fight a climate battle. It makes no sense. These conflations are very important. The Dakota Access, one of the other conflations, some of you may have strong feelings about Native Americans and broken treaties. There was a great exhibit at the American Indian Museum in Washington about 6 months ago on broken treaties. I mean, the United States broke all kinds of treaties. But the Native American population is using the pipeline as a way to bring up the issue of the treaties, because there was a disputed treaty which the pipeline is actually, the land has been owned by non-Native Americans for 100 years. But they're using the pipeline as a wedge, as a proxy, to fight this battle over Native American relations. So you have all these forces coming together. Yes?
What's the thinking on fracking these days? Do we think it's safe? Is it causing problems? Is it, earth movement, earthquakes, and all that?
Fracking, as I've said to you, very upfront, I would not want to live next to a drill site.
Why? Is there danger, or is it
No,
just
it's not that it's
unconvenient?
it's not pleasant. Again, oil and gas is a dirty and dangerous business. It's an industrial manufacturing business. So if you live next to a fracking site, you're living next to a manufacturing location. So, but first keep in mind that when they frack a well, it's a pretty short period of time. It's 6 or 8 months, and that well can be in production for a couple of years. So we're not talking about the life of the well. We're talking about a shorter period of that. But it's an industrial process, like things. I've spent some time at well sites. They're really fascinating. If you live in rural Pennsylvania or North Dakota, and you're trying to send your children to school, a fracking site it's like a military operation. So they literally have people with vests on and flags and stop signs. They have 20, 30 big trucks a day coming in, delivering sand, delivering fracking fluid, delivering all kinds of things, taking away wastewater. So it's an industrial site. So the reason I wouldn't want to live around it is because you're living around an industrial site. I'll preface that by saying, though, or I'll qualify that by saying, if someone paid me $750,000, which happens, I would maybe change my mind. And a lot of the problem with the people, the evidence is pretty clear. The closer you are to the well site, the less opposed to development. Because if you're in southwestern Pennsylvania, this is a job and it's money. And if you're in southwestern Pennsylvania or North Dakota, you own the title to that land in many cases, in most cases, and they're going to pay you a large amount of money to drill on your property. So the closer you are, the more people tend to not be against it. It's the people from the east side of New York, Yoko Ono, who has a house in Delaware County, that stops fracking in New York State. Whereas the whole southern tier of landowners in New York State were desperate, absolutely desperate to give their land, to sell their rights to the oil companies. So, fracking it's one of those things like, everything in this room, things in your house, these are industrial processes, and there's dangerous and dirty things. And actually, one of the things I don't like is eminent domain and confiscation of property. But that has more to do with pipelines. But, earthquakes is real, but it actually has technically nothing to do with fracking. It's wastewater injection. So you push the water into the well, you split the rock, you prop it open with sand, the oil or the gas comes out, and as the oil and gas comes out, there's flow back of the wastewater. So it took time before they figured out what to do with it, but one of the things they figured out to do with it is you take the wastewater, you put it in a truck or a barge, you send it to Texas, Oklahoma, or in some cases Ohio. You can't re-inject it to where you're using it because that's too expensive. If you have to frack the rock to get the oil out, it's going to cost you a lot of money of trying to push the water back in. So you take the water and you send it to Oklahoma, or you send it to Texas where you had a conventional well which was depleted, and you just stuff it down that well. And what we found, which is really true, is that if you do that in too large volumes, the natural faults in the rocks start to slip because you're lubricating them and you're putting pressure on the rocks. But that being said, there was one earthquake in Oklahoma in the last 6 months that was a 5 on the Richter scale. Most of these are 3s, 2s and 3s, which, some of you may remember the New York area earthquake here in 1986. It was like a 3, I remember. It woke me up in the morning. This is not going. This is not San Andreas. It is going to knock. That in New York it didn't, but a three will knock the china off the cabinet wall. The pictures. If your house is not constructed well, the door frame will tilt. You won't be able to close your door. It does damage. So what Oklahoma has done is that the legislature has taken up that when these occur, well, first they stop the companies from just randomly stuffing fracking fluid down holes without thinking about what it does, because we can figure out the load limits of the earth and where to put it, where not to put it. And then if they miscalculate in someone's house, there was a famous, the picture from the Times made the rounds, and if the brickwork of someone's house fell, you make the oil companies pay for it. So, and one thing about fracking for all of, look, people are selectively indignant about things. So if you want to be indignant about fracking, it's your right to be indignant. I won't mind to tell you not to, although I'm trying to give you some facts to think about it. I would just like to make you aware that more than half of all the oil we produce, back on that slide, where did it go? I'm not going to find it. Half the oil we produced was based on hydraulic fracturing. 2/3 of the natural gas that we produced was on hydraulic fracturing. You shut that off, how do you feel about paying 10 cents more a kilowatt for your electricity? Do you have that kind of money? Okay, maybe you do, but what about the people who don't? This is now the way the industry is run, and the issue to me is how do you regulate it, particularly at the state level? Back there?
Just a question on the sufficient supply. So in say 50 or 100 years, if India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, if they become quote unquote developed, is there still sufficient supply?
Hopefully in 100 years, the question was about as parts of the world like India and China develop, will there still be enough oil? I am an optimist that we won't be in the fossil fuel age anymore. Certainly 100 years from now. We're in the fossil fuel age 100 years from now. Unless the technology has completely changed where we have carbon capture and sequestration or something, we're not going to be using petroleum in any major way like today. So my thinking is let's get to 2035 and 2050 first. China is very aggressive about electronic cars, but if everyone in China drove an electronic car today, it would be an absolute disaster. It would be the worst environmental catastrophe you can imagine, because the demand for electricity would go up, and 65% of their electricity is created through the burning of coal. So, I'm pretty comfortable that this slide, for a time frame meaningful to me and my children, is what matters. It's hopefully by 2075, the internal combustion engine will be gradually in the minority. There's lots of indications that electronic cars will make market penetration 20, 30 years from now. And as that happens, and as we improve our ability through renewables to power the grid, we can get away from this system. So yeah, I'm comfortable with that. And it's a good question. Yes?
Yeah, that's the last question. But you can come up after, he'll stay for a few
In
minutes.
your opinion, what needs to happen to make the United States the innovator and economically successful in the renewable energy industry? Maybe finding even inventing new ways to capture renewable energy.
The renewable energy situation is very interesting, and the curve is sort of straight up in terms of its contribution. As we produce more and more of it, the ability of the grid to work with it becomes more problematic. When you build wind turbines or solar panels, you actually have to build a natural gas-fired power plant on the site to back it up, because the grid isn't big enough and widely dispersed enough that when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, that you have power. So we're actually doing very well in that regard. It's happening very quickly. For petroleum, for transportation, the issue is petroleum. For stationary power generation, we can continue to make inroads. Like, example is Germany. Germany now has so much wind and wind power in particular that they have all kinds of problems because they have excessive power and they can't get it to where it's needed, so they have to shove it into Poland and the Czech Republic and then force the Czechs to try to reroute it to Bavaria. The single best thing that we can do is spend money on technology of batteries. Battery technology is the biggest single thing holding back renewable energy, because the energy that you consume is essentially produced right before you consume it. The petroleum you consume, that field was found and drilled 10 years ago, and it started producing a long time ago. We don't have that ability to store energy. Electricity is very expensive to store. So battery technology is really the key. But again, what we're dealing with here is mobility versus stationary power. And I would just encourage you to separate the two, because the problems of petroleum or mobility, renewable, until electric cars take over in 30 or 40 years, is just not, when you go to the supermarket, in this room, when you all go to the supermarket in 10 years, most of you will be driving internal combustion engines with gasoline. And so that's the difference. Anyway, thank you so much.